By the time Clara reached the iron gates of Wycliffe Manor, she had nowhere left to go. Rain poured from the black sky in sheets, soaking through her worn dress and running down her face as she held her 4-month-old daughter tightly beneath her coat. Lily had been crying for nearly an hour. Now the crying had stopped, replaced by a small, frightening cough that made Clara tighten her arms around her. 6 weeks ago, Clara had still believed she had a husband, a home, and a future. Then Nathan disappeared. The only thing he left behind was a letter telling her not to search for him. Their marriage was over. He wanted nothing to do with her, or their child. Clara had read those words so many times that she could almost hear them in her sleep. Then came the unpaid rent. That afternoon, her landlord had placed her belongings outside and closed the door behind her. And now, with darkness swallowing the countryside and her baby growing colder against her chest, Clara stood before the one place every villager had warned her never to enter, Wycliffe Manor. The enormous estate had belonged to Duke Edmund Ashbourne until his death several months earlier. Since then, its gates had remained shut, its windows dark, and its grounds abandoned. People whispered that no servant would stay there after sunset. Clara did not care about whispers anymore. She cared about Lily. She pushed through the overgrown grounds until she found a damaged servant's entrance hanging partly open. Inside, the manor felt frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture. White sheets draped over chairs and portraits. Every footstep echoed through empty corridors. Then Clara stopped. High above her, at the end of the upper gallery, a candle was burning. Someone had lit it. Holding Lily closer, Clara climbed the staircase. The candle stood outside an old nursery. Inside were faded toys, a carved wooden cradle, and a large portrait hidden beneath a cloth. Clara hesitated before pulling the covering away. For several seconds, she could only stare. The young man in the portrait had Nathan's eyes, Nathan's mouth, even the same small scar beside his eyebrow. Clara moved closer, convinced exhaustion was playing tricks on her. Then she saw the inscription beneath the frame: Lord Nathaniel Edmund Ashbourne, beloved son and heir to Wycliffe. Her stomach tightened. The dates beneath the name claimed that Lord Nathaniel had died more than 20 years earlier. Yet Clara was staring at the face of her missing husband. Before she could make sense of it, a floorboard creaked behind her. Clara spun around. An elderly woman stood in the nursery doorway, pale and perfectly still. Mrs. Beatrice Hale, the former housekeeper of Wycliffe Manor, was not staring at Clara. Her eyes were fixed on the baby in Clara's arms, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get that child?" Clara instinctively pulled Lily closer. Because suddenly, the question was no longer why her husband had abandoned her. It was why the face of an ordinary man named Nathan Vale was hanging inside a dead duke's manor beneath the name of a son who had supposedly been dead for 20 years. Beatrice's face hardened almost immediately. Whatever shock had crossed it vanished behind years of discipline, and she told Clara that she had no business wandering through Wycliffe Manor. The house was private property, the nursery was forbidden, and Clara needed to take her child and leave before anyone else discovered she was there. But Clara had already survived too much that day to be frightened away by an old housekeeper. She turned back toward the portrait and studied the painted face again. The resemblance was impossible to dismiss. The dark eyes, the shape of the mouth. Even that tiny mark beside the left eyebrow, the same scar Clara had traced with her finger countless times while Nathan slept beside her. She told Beatrice that the man in the portrait looked exactly like her husband. Then she gave his name, Nathan Vale. The effect was immediate. Beatrice went completely still. For several seconds, the only sound in the nursery was the rain striking the windows and Lily shifting softly against Clara's chest. Beatrice demanded proof. Clara almost laughed at the cruelty of the question. 6 weeks earlier, she could have brought Nathan himself. Now all she had were the things he had left behind. She reached beneath her dress and removed the wedding ring she had tied to a thin cord around her neck. Nathan had given it to her on a quiet morning 2 years earlier, when they had married, with no grand celebration, no noble guests, and nothing between them except promises they had both believed would last forever. But it was the second object that changed Beatrice's expression. Clara carefully drew a small silver pendant from beneath Lily's blanket. Nathan had placed it beside their daughter shortly after her birth. He had told Clara only that it had belonged to his family and that one day Lily should have it. Beatrice recognized it before Clara had even finished explaining. The pendant bore the Ashbourne crest. It had belonged to Nathaniel. Until that moment, Clara had believed she understood the man she married. Nathan had never been wealthy. He had worked as an estate clerk, kept careful accounts, repaired things himself rather than paying others, and seemed almost embarrassed whenever conversation turned toward noble families. He had told Clara that his parents died when he was young, and that a struggling couple had raised him far from the capital. He rarely spoke about anything before that. Clara had never pressed him. Their life together had been modest, but it had been happy. Then Clara became pregnant. Around the same time, letters began arriving. Nathan never opened them in front of her. At first, she thought little of it. Then she noticed how quiet he became after reading them. Some nights, he sat awake long after she had gone to bed, staring toward the window as though expecting someone to appear outside. After Lily was born, the letters became more frequent, and then, 6 weeks earlier, Nathan told Clara he had to travel to the capital, only for one day. He kissed Lily before leaving. He promised Clara he would return before the following evening. He never did. Days passed. Then, a letter arrived. Nathan supposedly told her not to search for him. Their life together was finished. He wanted no responsibility for her or their daughter. Clara had read the words until the paper became soft at the folds. She had hated him. Then she had hated herself for still hoping he might walk through the door. Without Nathan's wages, their small debts became impossible to meet. Friends who once smiled at Clara began avoiding her. The landlord stopped accepting promises. Eventually, even the room she and Lily slept in was taken away, and that was how she had ended up inside the abandoned manor of a dead duke. But Beatrice was now looking at her as though the past 20 years had suddenly returned. Duke Edmund Ashbourne, she explained, had once had an eldest son named Nathaniel. The boy was believed to have died during an attack on a royal carriage while being transported through the countryside. No body had ever been properly identified, but there had been enough blood, wreckage, and confusion for the family to accept the worst. Edmund never truly recovered. For more than 20 years, he believed his heir was dead. Then, shortly before his own death, evidence reached him that Nathaniel had survived. The child had been taken far from Wycliffe, raised by another family, given another surname, and the name he had lived under as an adult was Nathan Vale. The truth struck Clara harder than the cold outside ever had. Her husband had been born the son of a duke. The man who counted coins before buying bread had been the heir to Wycliffe, and he had never told her. Anger rose beneath her confusion, but Beatrice stopped it with something far more disturbing. Nathan had been at Wycliffe Manor. Beatrice had seen him herself. He arrived after Duke Edmund's death, carrying letters and demanding answers about the father he had barely known, and he had arrived exactly 6 weeks earlier, the same week Clara received the letter, claiming he had abandoned her. If Nathan had come here, then something had happened between his arrival at Wycliffe and the moment that letter reached Clara. Beatrice had been trying to discover whatever since. Before Clara could absorb another word, a dull sound echoed through the manor. A door closing somewhere above them. Clara froze. Beatrice did too. Neither woman had moved, and for the first time since Clara entered Wycliffe Manor, the candle outside the nursery no longer seemed mysterious. It seemed like a warning, because someone else was inside the house. Clara should have been terrified enough to leave. Instead, the sound from somewhere inside the manor made her more determined to stay. For 6 weeks, she had believed Nathan had chosen to disappear from her life. In less than an hour, that certainty had begun to collapse. His face hung on the wall of Wycliffe Manor under another name. The pendant he had left their daughter belonged to the Ashbourne family, and Beatrice had seen him here during the very week he supposedly abandoned his wife and child. Clara was not walking away without knowing why. Beatrice resisted at first. There were things inside Wycliffe that Duke Edmund had ordered kept hidden, even from members of his own family. But when Clara reminded her that Nathan was missing and Lily might unknowingly be connected to whatever had happened here, the old woman finally relented. She led Clara away from the nursery and down a narrow corridor in the oldest part of the manor. At its end stood a heavy oak door. It had remained locked since Duke Edmund's death. Beatrice produced a small iron key she had carried all those months and opened it. Inside, the air smelled of dust, paper, and cedar. This was no ordinary study. It was a room built around one man's attempt to recover a son he believed he had buried more than 20 years ago. Letters covered the desk. Old family records had been arranged by date. In one cabinet were childhood clothes, a wooden horse, school papers, and several miniature portraits of Nathaniel Ashbourne. Clara hardly needed the names written beneath them anymore. Every image looked like Nathan. Then Beatrice showed her the letters Duke Edmund had written during the final months of his life. The truth emerged piece by piece. Edmund had received information suggesting the child lost in the carriage attack might not have died at all. Witnesses had reported seeing an injured boy carried away before officials reached the wreckage. Years of investigation eventually led the Duke to a young man living under the name Nathan Vale. Edmund had contacted him privately. Nathan had initially refused to believe him, but eventually the two men met. Not after Edmund's death, before it. That revelation stopped Clara. Nathan had known, perhaps not for years, but long enough to understand that the life he had described to her was missing an extraordinary truth. Beatrice explained that Edmund had become convinced Nathan was his son. There were childhood marks Nathan could identify, memories no stranger could have known, and family records that supported his survival. The Duke intended to restore him publicly as Nathaniel Ashbourne, eldest son and rightful heir to Wycliffe, but he never lived long enough to do it. Among the papers, Clara found a formal declaration carrying Edmund's seal. It changed everything again. If Nathaniel lived, the Wycliffe title and estate were to pass to him. And if Nathaniel died after producing a lawful child, that child's claim would follow his. Clara slowly looked down at Lily. Until that moment, her daughter had been only an abandoned infant in the eyes of the world. Now Clara understood that Lily's existence could stand between another person and one of the most valuable estates in the kingdom. There was only one man who benefited from Nathan remaining dead: Lord Victor Ashbourne, Duke Edmund's younger brother. With Nathaniel presumed dead and Edmund gone, Victor had stepped forward as the surviving male claimant and had taken control of Wycliffe's affairs while preparing to secure the title permanently. If Nathan returned, Victor lost everything: the estate, the authority, the position he had waited decades to inherit. And if Nathan could be made to disappear again, Lily became the next problem. That thought made Clara instinctively tighten her hold on the baby. Then she noticed another sheet of paper lying beneath a ledger. It was addressed to her. The handwriting made her heart stop. Nathan's. This was not the cold, unfamiliar hand from the letter that had ended their marriage. Clara knew every uneven stroke. Nathan had always pressed too hard when writing her name. He had always ended private notes with the same small phrase, one so ordinary that no stranger would have thought to imitate it. That phrase was there. The letter had never been sent. Nathan wrote that Victor knew who he was. He feared he might be prevented from reaching the royal council with his father's evidence, and if anything happened to him, Clara was not to trust anyone who came claiming to speak on his behalf. Then came the warning that chilled her most. Clara and Lily could be in danger. She pulled the other letter from inside her coat, the one that had supposedly told her their marriage was over. Now that she compared them, the differences seemed painfully obvious. Different turns of phrase, different pressure in the handwriting. None of Nathan's familiar expressions. Even his name had been signed too carefully. Clara had spent 6 weeks mourning a betrayal that might never have happened. Someone had wanted her to stop searching. Before she could say anything more, a sound came from behind the wall. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. Clara stared at Beatrice. Then they heard them again. 3 knocks. Beatrice began searching the wood paneling until her hand found a concealed latch behind one of the shelves. A narrow section of wall opened inward. Beyond it lay an old servant's passage, dark and steep, descending beneath the manor. Clara followed, with Lily held against her chest. At the bottom stood a locked chamber. The knocking came again, this time from the other side of the door. They forced it open. A thin beam of candlelight entered the room. A man sat against the far wall, gaunt, exhausted, and covered by weeks of beard. He lifted his head. Clara stopped breathing. Nathan was alive. For one terrible second, neither of them moved. Then Nathan's eyes found the baby in Clara's arms, and whatever strength remained in him seemed to gather into a single expression of disbelief and relief. He had not abandoned them. He had been beneath Wycliffe Manor all along. And seeing Clara standing there with Lily, Nathan could barely manage the words that had been waiting 6 weeks to be spoken. She had come. For several seconds, Clara could do nothing but stare at the man she had spent 6 weeks believing had abandoned her. Nathan was thinner than she remembered. His face was pale beneath the untrimmed beard. His clothes were stained, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes. But when he looked at Lily, Clara saw the same tenderness that had been there the morning he left home. There was no time for the reunion either of them deserved. With Beatrice helping him to his feet, Nathan explained what had happened after Duke Edmund's death. Before dying, Edmund had gathered enough evidence to prove that Nathan Vale was truly Nathaniel Ashbourne, his lost eldest son. Nathan had intended to take that evidence directly to the royal council, where his identity could be formally recognized and the succession settled. But Victor had discovered the plan. Nathan had barely left Wycliffe Manor before Victor's men intercepted him. Bringing him before the authorities would have destroyed Victor's claim, but killing the newly discovered heir would have created questions no powerful family could easily bury. So Victor chose something quieter. He made Nathan disappear. Nathan had been dragged back through a concealed entrance and imprisoned beneath the very manor that should have belonged to him. Victor needed only enough time to be formally confirmed as Duke of Wycliffe. Once the title, estate, accounts and influence were safely under his control, Nathan's return would be much easier to dismiss as the desperate claim of an impostor. And Clara had been dealt with just as carefully. Nathan had never written the letter ending their marriage. Victor had arranged it. If Clara believed her husband had willingly deserted her, she would have no reason to search Wycliffe, no reason to ask questions in the capital, and no reason to connect Nathan Vale with the dead Duke's lost son. For 6 weeks, Victor's plan had worked perfectly, until Clara walked through the broken servant's door. But Nathan's relief disappeared when Clara told him about the declaration she had found upstairs. The document was important, but it was not enough. It was only a copy. The original succession declaration carried not only Duke Edmund's seal, but the signatures and seals of the witnesses who had been present when it was executed. Without that original, Victor could still argue that Edmund's private papers had been altered or fabricated. Fortunately, Victor had never found it. On the night Nathan realized he was being watched, he had hidden the original somewhere no one searching a duke's study would think to look. Inside the wooden base of Nathaniel's old nursery cradle. They hurried upstairs. Beatrice remained close to Nathan, while Clara went straight to the nursery. She lowered Lily onto a blanket beside her and examined the carved cradle. The craftsmanship was beautiful, but Clara's years as a seamstress had taught her something useful. Important things were often concealed beneath ordinary coverings. A narrow strip of fabric had been fixed beneath the wooden base. Clara loosened it carefully. A folded parchment slipped into her hand. The original declaration, Duke Edmund's seal, remained intact. Beneath it were the witnesses' signatures, confirming Nathaniel Ashbourne as his surviving son, and recognizing Nathaniel's lawful descendants in the Wycliffe succession. For the first time, Clara held proof that could destroy Victor's entire future. Then carriage wheels sounded outside. Beatrice went pale. Victor had returned. Within minutes, the silence of Wycliffe Manor was broken by boots crossing the entrance hall. Victor entered surrounded by estate guards, dressed with the calm elegance of a man who believed the house already belonged to him. He did not shout. He did not threaten Clara immediately. That made him more frightening. Victor treated Nathan as though he were a confused stranger who had somehow convinced a desperate woman that he belonged to the Ashbourne family. He spoke gently of Clara's poverty, her eviction, and the difficulties of raising an infant alone. Then he offered her everything she had lacked: money, a comfortable cottage, a permanent allowance large enough to ensure Lily would never know hunger. There was only one condition. Clara had to surrender whatever documents she had found and publicly state that Nathan had deceived her. For a woman who had entered the manor with nowhere to sleep, It was the kind of offer Victor expected to be irresistible. Clara refused it. Only then did his politeness become dangerous. Victor reminded her that if she intended to present Lily as a possible heir to one of the kingdom's great noble houses, the child would no longer be considered an entirely private matter. Until the dispute was resolved, he could petition the crown to place Lily under temporary aristocratic guardianship. The meaning was unmistakable. Clara could lose her daughter. Nathan immediately wanted her to surrender the evidence. No title or estate was worth risking Lily, but Victor had made one mistake. He assumed Clara was carrying the declaration. She wasn't. While Nathan had been explaining his imprisonment downstairs, Clara had already understood that anyone who wanted the dukedom badly enough to imprison a man might search her next. So she had done what years of sewing had taught her to do, quickly and invisibly. She had opened a small section of Lily's blanket lining, slipped the original declaration inside, and stitched the seam closed again. When Victor ordered the manor searched, his men found papers, copies, old letters, nothing capable of proving Nathan's claim before the crown. Victor believed he had won. By morning, he announced, the royal council would hear the matter and end the absurd dispute once and for all. And if Clara arrived without proof that her daughter truly belonged in the Ashbourne succession, Victor would ask the crown to remove Lily from her care. Clara said nothing. She simply held her baby closer, because hidden only inches from Victor's eyes, beneath the soft blanket wrapped around Lily, was the document that could bring his stolen dukedom crashing down. By the following morning, Seraphine had transformed the violence of the banquet into a weapon against Evelina. She insisted that Clara's attack had not been an act of panic, but part of a carefully planned attempt to murder the Duke. And she persuaded Alistair that his marriage had become a threat to the stability of Ravenscroft. Before noon, Evelina was summoned from confinement and led into his private council chamber. An annulment agreement waited on the table. Alistair told her that she could return to Harcourt with her reputation protected, provided she signed the document and never spoke publicly about the banquet. No formal accusation would be made against her. The scandal would disappear quietly, and both of them could escape a marriage that had brought neither peace nor affection. For one dangerous moment, the offer felt like freedom. Then Evelina read the final page. The protection granted to the Harcourt tenants depended entirely upon the continuation of their marriage. Once the union was dissolved, the debts would return to her family, and the estate would be seized before winter. Alistair offered her dignity at the price of hundreds of homes. He appeared almost ashamed when she confronted him with it, yet he did not withdraw the agreement. He claimed the council would never permit him to continue supporting the Harcourt lands after an annulment. Evelina placed the unsigned document back on the table. She had already sacrificed her happiness for those families. She would not abandon them merely because her husband had discovered that defending his mistress was easier than defending his wife. That evening, she demanded permission to visit Clara. The palace cells lay beneath the eastern tower, where moisture darkened the stone and torchlight barely reached the floor. Clara sat behind iron bars, pale from the poison, but still alert. The cut across her palm had been wrapped in linen, and bruises circled her wrists where the guards had seized her. Evelina's relief quickly gave way to anger. She accused Clara of hiding too much, of entering Seraphine's service without explanation, and of allowing her own sister to believe she had chosen power over loyalty. Clara listened without interrupting. Then she revealed the truth Evelina had misunderstood for years. Their father had never drawn Clara close because he loved her more. Clara's mother had once discovered that criminals were using Harcourt ships to transport forbidden medicines and poisonous plants through the northern ports. Some of those shipments carried the mark of noble households. Their father had kept Clara near him because he feared that anyone connected to her mother's discovery might be silenced. What Evelina had mistaken for favoritism had been fear. The knowledge struck more painfully than any insult Seraphine had delivered. Years of distance between the sisters had grown from a secret neither of them had been permitted to understand. Clara then confirmed what she had seen at the banquet. The powder, placed on Alistair's goblet, had been poison. Worse, the symptoms he had suffered for weeks suggested that someone had been weakening him slowly through his regular medicine. From inside the bandage around her wrist, Clara removed a small brass key. She had stolen it from Seraphine's chamber during the days she pretended to serve her. It opened an abandoned records room beneath the palace chapel. The hidden passage leading to Julian's apartments passed close to it, and Clara believed the room contained old shipping ledgers, medical accounts, or correspondence linking the sealed packages to the poison. Before Evelina could ask what else she knew, Clara's eyes shifted toward the shadows beyond the cell. Someone was listening. She lowered her voice and refused to say more. The following day, Evelina learned that Seraphine intended to have Clara tried for attempting to assassinate the Duke. The punishment would almost certainly be death. Evelina still had a way to save herself. She could accept the annulment, return to Harcourt, and leave Clara to face the accusation alone. Instead, she concealed the key beneath her sleeve and prepared to enter the records room after midnight. As she turned to leave the cells, Clara gave her one final warning. She told Evelina not to trust the man who kept offering to save her. Evelina thought she meant Alistair, but the man Clara feared was the one who had shown Evelina kindness from the beginning, the one waiting patiently for her to uncover exactly what he needed destroyed. Long after the palace bells marked midnight, Evelina slipped from her guarded rooms through a servant's corridor concealed behind the old library. The brass key Clara had given her felt unnaturally heavy in her palm. Every shadow seemed to move with her, and every distant footstep sounded like a guard turning in her direction. The chapel stood deserted beneath the cold glow of moonlight. Behind the altar, Evelina found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. At its end waited a rusted door that had not been opened in years. The key turned. Inside, shelves sagged beneath forgotten ledgers, sealed correspondence, and wooden boxes bearing the Ravenscroft crest. Dust covered everything except one section near the rear wall. Someone had visited that part of the chamber recently. Evelina searched until she found shipping records connected to the northern ports. Several entries matched the dates on which unmarked packages had arrived at the palace. Beside them were payments for medicinal plants, including black hellebore, all authorized through accounts connected to Julian's household. But the most dangerous discovery lay inside a locked chest belonging to Alistair's late father. The letters Seraphine had used to control the Duke were there, but they were not the same letters Julian had described. The versions kept by Seraphine ended with an order to send soldiers into a rebellious village. The originals continued for several pages. They showed that Alistair's father had commanded the soldiers to evacuate the villagers before the fighting began. The order to burn the settlement had come later. It had been written by Julian's father. Seraphine's power over Alistair had been built upon missing pages, altered seals, and a crime committed by another branch of the Ravenscroft family. The scandal capable of destroying the Duke had never truly belonged to his father. Evelina continued searching and found a smaller ledger hidden beneath a stack of medical reports. It contained private payments made to a village midwife who had examined Seraphine months before the pregnancy announcement. The dates told their own story. According to the midwife's records, Seraphine had already been carrying her child while Alistair was inspecting the northern border, hundreds of miles from Ravenscroft Palace. The child could not be his. Tucked inside the ledger was a letter written in Seraphine's hand. It spoke of the child inheriting the duchy after Alistair had grown too weak to oppose them. It also promised devotion to a man identified only by one initial. Evelina heard the door close behind her. Julian stood at the foot of the stairs, no longer wearing the gentle expression of the concerned cousin who had repeatedly offered his help. He looked almost relieved that the deception was finally over. He admitted that the child was his. He and Seraphine had intended to weaken Alistair slowly, allowing his illness to appear natural. Once the Duke died, suspicion would fall upon the unwanted wife, who had arrived shortly before his health began to fail. Seraphine would present her son as Alistair's heir, while Julian would govern the duchy as the child's guardian. Everything had been prepared. The false letters, the physician's reports, the poison found in Seraphine's chambers, even Clara's apparent attack at the banquet. Julian offered Evelina one final chance. She could sign the annulment, abandon Clara, and leave Ravenscroft before the royal council arrived. Her life would be spared as long as she never spoke of what she had discovered. Evelina refused. She seized the midwife's letter and rushed toward the stairs, but footsteps sounded above them. Alistair entered the chamber after receiving an anonymous message claiming his wife was destroying evidence against his family. What he saw appeared damning. Evelina stood inside a forbidden archive with Julian beside her and a secret letter clenched in her hand. Before she could explain, Julian claimed that Evelina had summoned him there to help burn the documents connected to the village massacre. Alistair reached for the letter, but Julian tore it from Evelina's grasp and thrust it into the flame of a nearby lamp. Within seconds, the proof curled into ash. Alistair looked at his wife with suspicion, while Julian watched the fire consume the truth. And somewhere above them, Seraphine received word that Evelina now knew everything. Before the royal council reached Ravenscroft, the Duchess would have to be silenced permanently. Several weeks later, Wycliffe Manor no longer looked like a place the world had forgotten. For the first time since Duke Edmund's death, its tall windows stood open to the morning air. Sunlight reached rooms that had remained covered in dust for months. Servants moved through the halls again. Curtains were drawn back. Damaged furniture was repaired, and the gardens slowly began to lose the wild, abandoned look Clara remembered from the night she arrived there in the rain. Nathan recovered more slowly. Weeks of confinement had left their mark on him, but each day brought back a little more of the man Clara had known. His strength returned. The hollows beneath his eyes faded, and eventually he was able to carry Lily through the gardens without Beatrice anxiously following 3 steps behind him. But becoming Duke and Duchess of Wycliffe did not erase everything that had happened between Clara and Nathan. One evening, when the manor had grown quiet, Clara finally asked the question she had carried since discovering the portrait in the nursery. Why had Nathan never told her who he might really be? Nathan did not try to excuse himself. For most of his life, he had believed he was an unwanted orphan with no family worth searching for. Even when the first letters from Duke Edmund began arriving, he had been afraid to believe them. Part of him feared discovering the truth. Another part feared what that truth might do to the simple life he had built with Clara. He had wanted her to love Nathan Vale, not Nathaniel Ashbourne, not an heir, not a future duke, just him. But Clara understood something Nathan had failed to understand. Love could survive an uncomfortable truth. It was secrecy that had nearly destroyed them. Nathan did not ask her to forget those 6 weeks. He did not expect forgiveness, simply because Victor had been responsible for the worst of it. He promised her something much simpler. There would be no more hidden letters, no more unanswered questions, no more secrets between them. And slowly, Clara allowed herself to believe him. Beatrice was restored as housekeeper of Wycliffe, a position she accepted with more pride than she cared to show. Nathan also began examining the estate accounts Victor had controlled. Families who had lost homes, wages, or land through Victor's decisions were compensated wherever possible. Victor himself was stripped of every authority he had claimed and remained in royal custody awaiting judgment. But Clara rarely thought about him anymore. Her thoughts belonged to something far smaller. One afternoon, she returned to the old nursery, the same room where everything had begun. The portrait of young Nathaniel still hung on the wall, but the cloth covering it was gone. The carved cradle had been restored, and inside it, Lily slept peacefully, one tiny hand curled beside her face. Clara stood there for a long moment. Only weeks earlier, she had entered that room, soaked from the rain, penniless, terrified, and convinced that the man she loved had deliberately abandoned her. She had been searching for nothing more than a dry floor where her daughter could survive the night. Instead, she had uncovered a stolen inheritance, found her missing husband alive, and destroyed a lie powerful men believed they had buried forever. But becoming a duchess was not what had changed Clara most. What changed her was realizing that desperation had never made her powerless. The moment she stopped accepting the story others had written for her, everything began to change. Soon afterward, the great gates of Wycliffe Manor opened again. Nathan stood beside Clara, with Lily in his arms, as servants, tenants, and villagers entered the estate grounds for the first time since Duke Edmund's death. And the woman who had once slipped through a broken servant's entrance because she had nowhere else to go, now walked openly through the front doors of Wycliffe Manor. Not as a frightened stranger, not as an abandoned wife, but as the woman who had fought for her family and finally found the home no one could take from her. If Clara's journey reminded you that one brave decision can change an entire life, subscribe and join us for more powerful stories of love, betrayal, courage, and secrets hidden behind palace doors.